Each year, special forces operators across the globe are deployed into classified theaters of war where conventional military doctrine simply doesn't apply, where the rules of engagement become meaningless against threats that exist outside the boundaries of accepted reality, and where entire units can vanish from official records as if they never drew breath or pulled a trigger. The Department of Defense allocates over $14 billion annually to special access programs that don't appear in any public budget. Black operations, so deeply buried that even congressional oversight committees receive nothing more than sanitized summaries and redacted casualty reports. During the Syrian civil war between 2011 and 2019, over 400,000 civilians lost their lives in a conflict that drew in military forces from 17 different nations, creating a chaotic battlefield where war crimes and chemical weapons became routine tools of suppression, and where the fog of war grew thick enough to hide operations that would make even seasoned intelligence analysts question their sanity. For a brief period during the winter of 2017, one particular special forces reconnaissance team operating deep behind enemy lines in the Deir ez-Zor province stumbled upon an underground research facility that had been conducting experiments so profoundly disturbing, so fundamentally wrong that it would force the Pentagon to rewrite entire sections of their threat assessment protocols and create new classification levels that exist beyond top secret. But what exactly were the Syrian government scientists attempting to create in those subterranean laboratories carved beneath 400 feet of solid bedrock? And why did an entire 12-man special forces team simply cease to exist in all official military databases within 72 hours of their final radio transmission? The Deir ez-Zor province stretches across nearly 33,000 square kilometers of eastern Syria, a vast expanse of scorched desert punctuated by the snaking Euphrates River and scattered settlements that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires dating back to ancient Mesopotamia. The region's brutal climate swings from searing 120-degree summers that can kill an unprotected man in hours to winter nights that plummet below freezing, creating a landscape so hostile that even the hardiest Bedouin tribes avoid certain valleys where the wind carries sounds that don't belong to any living creature. The area's geological instability has created hundreds of limestone cave systems and natural underground chambers, many of which remain unmapped and unexplored, perfect hiding places for military installations that governments would prefer to keep hidden from satellite surveillance and international weapons inspectors. It is perhaps unsurprising then that this desolate region, so far removed from the watchful eyes of Western intelligence agencies, would become a testing ground for experiments that violated every international convention on human rights and biological warfare. The ancient Assyrians who ruled this territory over 2,700 years ago carved warnings into cuneiform tablets discovered in 1923 by French archaeologists. Tablets that described what they called the Namtar Ilu, or fate demons, entities that their priests claimed emerged from deep caverns during certain lunar phases to claim victims whose bodies would be found days later, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. These tablets, currently locked away in a restricted section of the British Museum, detail surgical procedures performed by these entities, describing how victims would be suspended by their own circulatory systems and systematically disassembled while still conscious, their screams echoing through underground chambers that the Assyrian military sealed with stone and bitumen. Medieval Arab texts from the 12th century reference a place they called Bab al-Jinn al-Asfal, the Gate of the Lower Demons, located somewhere in the eastern deserts, where caravan traders reported seeing lights beneath the sand at night and hearing sounds like metal instruments scraping against bone. The Ottoman Empire's military records from 1891 document an entire garrison of 73 soldiers who disappeared while investigating reports of unusual activity near ancient ruins in what is now Deir ez-Zor, with only one survivor found 3 weeks later, a man who had carved his own eyes out and could only repeat the phrase, "They are still operating in broken Turkish," before dying from self-inflicted wounds. CIA intelligence reports from 1982, declassified in 2019 with heavy redactions, reference a Soviet Spetsnaz team that entered Syria during the Lebanese Civil War to investigate what Moscow believed was an Israeli biological weapons facility in the eastern provinces. The 8-man team transmitted a final radio message describing an underground complex with surgical theaters operating without human personnel before all communication ceased permanently. And satellite imagery from that period shows a massive explosion that collapsed nearly 2 square kilometers of desert surface. An explosion the Soviets officially attributed to a failed missile test, but which created seismic readings inconsistent with any known conventional explosive. Similar encounters were reported by French Foreign Legion units in 1995 who were conducting covert reconnaissance along the Syrian-Iraqi border. Soldiers who described finding abandoned facilities with operating rooms containing restraint systems designed for bodies that didn't conform to human anatomy, equipment that appeared functional despite having no visible power source, and walls covered in a biological residue that field analysis suggested contained human DNA mixed with genetic markers that didn't correspond to any known terrestrial organism. These reports were immediately classified under NATO's Cosmic Top Secret designation, and the 3 soldiers who filed the initial incident report were quietly transferred to psychiatric facilities and subsequently discharged from military service under medical pretenses that cited acute stress disorder and paranoid delusions. February 19th, 2017, 0230 hours, 12 kilometers southeast of Al-Mayadin, in a stretch of desert so remote that our GPS coordinates didn't correspond to any mapped location in the military database. I was Staff Sergeant Marcus Thornwell, Calcine Reaper 16 leader of a Special Forces Reconnaissance Unit designated as Task Force Obsidian, a unit that officially didn't exist in any Department of Defense roster, and whose operations were funded through black budget allocations that cycled through 17 different shell corporations. My team consisted of 11 of the most experienced operators the military had ever produced, men who had survived deployments in Fallujah, Kandahar, and a dozen other hellholes that never made the evening news soldiers who communicated in the abbreviated language of professionals who trusted each other with their lives on a nightly basis. Sergeant First Class David Chun, Calcine Reaper 2, our communications specialist, and the closest thing I had to a best friend, after 6 years of operations together, was running point as we approached the coordinates our handler had transmitted through encrypted satellite bursts just 4 hours earlier. The mission brief had been characteristically vague, something about a suspected chemical weapons facility that Syrian government forces had abandoned during their retreat from ISIS 3 months prior, a target that Langley wanted eyes on before Russian military advisors could sanitize whatever evidence remained. The temperature had dropped to near freezing our breath, forming clouds in the green-tinted world visible through our night vision goggles, and the only sounds were the whisper of wind across sand dunes and the muffled crunch of our boots against hard-packed earth. We had been moving in tactical formation for nearly 2 hours when Chun raised his fist in the universal signal for halt, his body language conveying tension that made every operator behind him instantly go to high alert fingers, moving to trigger guards with practiced precision. What made my blood run cold wasn't the signal itself, but what I saw through my night vision in the valley ahead. A perfectly circular depression in the desert floor, roughly 40 meters in diameter, and rising from its center was a concrete structure that shouldn't have existed. A ventilation shaft constructed from reinforced materials that looked far too sophisticated for any Syrian government installation. Its surface still pristine, despite years of sandstorms and the general decay that consumed everything in this forsaken region. We approached in a standard recon pattern, Chun and I taking lead, while Corporal James Mitchell, Calcine Reaper 4, covered our 6 with the squad automatic weapon that could put down suppressing fire if things went sideways. The ventilation shaft stood roughly 8 feet tall, constructed from a poured concrete that had a strange texture under my gloved hand. Smooth, but with microscopic grooves that formed patterns my eyes couldn't quite follow in the darkness. What bothered me immediately was the complete absence of structural damage. No bullet holes from the countless firefights that had raged. Through this province, no scorch marks from airstrikes, nothing that suggested this facility had been touched by the war that had reduced every other building for 50 kilometers to rubble and rebar. The air emerging from the shaft carried a smell that made my combat-hardened stomach clench. A mixture of disinfectant chemicals, similar to industrial bleach, but with an underlying organic sweetness, like rotting flowers mixed with copper. And beneath that, something else that reminded me of the way a hospital smells right after major surgery. That specific combination of blood and antiseptic that gets into your nostrils and won't leave. Chun pulled out his handheld CBRN detector, a device designed to identify chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. And the readings that appeared on the small LED screen made him look at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Genuine confusion mixed with something approaching fear. The atmospheric composition readings showed oxygen levels slightly lower than normal, but what made no sense were the trace organic compounds. The device was detecting complex protein chains and amino acid structures that the military's database flagged as biological markers inconsistent with known terrestrial classification, a designation I'd never seen in 7 years of handling sophisticated detection equipment. Every radio on our team suddenly erupted with static, not the normal interference we'd experience from atmospheric conditions, but a rhythmic pulsing that almost sounded like breathing. And when Chun tried to report our findings to forward operating base, his transmission was met with what sounded like someone else's voice, speaking underneath his own words, not clearly enough to make out what was being said, but present enough that 3 other team members confirmed, hearing it through their own headsets. The temperature around the ventilation shaft felt wrong, my skin registering cold, but my body reacting as if exposed to intense heat. And when I pulled my glove off for just a moment to touch the concrete surface, my fingertips came away covered in a thin film of moisture that was too viscous to be condensation, too warm to be water, and when I brought it close to my night vision goggle, I could see it had a faint luminescence like bioluminescent plankton, but colored a deep amber that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the static in our radios. We had been examining the shaft for perhaps 10 minutes when Specialist Trevor Harrison, Calcine Reaper 9, our youngest operator at 23 years old and a kid from Montana, who joined Special Forces to escape a life of poverty and dead-end jobs, made the mistake of leaning too close to the opening while trying to get a better angle with his tactical camera. The change happened so fast that my brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. One moment Harrison was securing his rappelling line to prepare for descent, and the next moment something reached up from inside that shaft, not a hand or tentacle, but something that existed in between those concepts, an appendage that seemed to be constructed from surgical tubing and raw muscle tissue that glistened weightily in our night vision. The thing wrapped around Harrison's ankle with impossible speed and yanked him into the shaft before he could even scream. And the only sound we heard was his helmet striking concrete as he disappeared into darkness that seemed deeper and more absolute than any natural shadow. Chun and I rushed to the opening, our rifle lights piercing down into a vertical tunnel that descended far deeper than our beams could reach, and for just a moment, I saw Harrison's face looking up at us from perhaps 40 feet down, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror that transcended anything combat could produce. Then the lights went out. Not our lights, but every electronic device we carried. Night vision goggles, weapon-mounted flashlights, radios, GPS units, even the tritium sights on our rifles that required no power source. Everything went dark simultaneously, as if something had reached out and switched off the laws of physics that made light possible. We stood there in absolute darkness, for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 seconds. And in that void, I heard sounds that will haunt me until the day I die. The wet sound of tearing tissue, the crack of bones being separated at joints with surgical precision, and underneath it all, a sound like dozens of metal instruments clicking together in a rhythm that suggested purpose and intelligence. When our equipment finally flickered back to life, Harrison was gone, but hanging from the walls of the shaft at regular intervals were pieces of his gear, his helmet, his vest, his weapons arranged in a pattern that formed a perfect spiral descending into the depths. And the concrete walls between each item were marked with something that looked like surgical incisions, perfectly straight cuts that wept a clear fluid that our CBRN detector now identified as containing human cerebrospinal fluid mixed with compounds. It simply labeled as unknown biological origin. The static in our radios had resolved into something worse, a sound that could have been breathing or could have been machinery. And underneath it, so faint we almost convinced ourselves we were imagining it, we could hear Harrison screaming, not with his voice, but with something else. Screams that came from somewhere deeper than his throat, and they were still echoing up from that shaft when I made the decision that would save some of our lives and doom the rest. I pulled the team back 50 meters from the ventilation shaft, establishing a defensive perimeter while my mind raced through every protocol and contingency plan the military had drilled into us over countless training scenarios. Chun was already attempting to raise our forward operating base on multiple frequencies, cycling through encrypted channels and emergency backup systems. But every transmission was met with that same rhythmic static that now seemed to carry a pattern, almost like Morse code, but in a sequence that didn't correspond to any military or civilian communication standard we'd been trained to recognize. Sergeant Marcus Webb calcined Reaper 3 our intelligence. Analyst who'd spent 4 years working with NSA signals, Intercept before joining Special Forces, pulled out his tablet and began running the static pattern through analysis software, his fingers moving across the screen with increasing agitation as the results populated. His face went pale in the glow of the display, and when he showed me what the software had identified, I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the desert night air. The pattern wasn't random noise or equipment malfunction. It was repeating sequences of data that the software recognized as similar to medical telemetry, the kind of biomonitoring signals that hospitals use to track patient vitals during surgery. Except these readings showed heart rates exceeding 240 beats per minute, blood oxygen levels that were simultaneously too high and too low in ways that violated basic physiology, and neural activity patterns that suggested consciousness but distributed across multiple locations, simultaneously, as if a single mind was somehow occupying different spaces. Webb looked at me with eyes that begged me to tell him his equipment was malfunctioning, that what we were seeing wasn't real. But I'd worked with him long enough to know his gear was always calibrated, perfectly maintained with an obsessive precision that bordered on religious devotion. I made the call to split the team. 5 operators would maintain security on the surface, while the remaining 7 of us would conduct a tactical descent into the facility to recover Harrison's body and gather intelligence on whatever the hell was operating down there. A decision that felt wrong, even as I gave the order, but one that military protocol and basic human decency demanded we follow. We found the main entrance 30 meters east of the ventilation shaft, a reinforced blast door set into a concrete structure that had been carefully concealed beneath a layer of sand and camouflage netting that had degraded to the point of near transparency. The door itself was marked with Syrian military insignia, but also with symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that hurt to look at too directly, shapes that seemed to shift and reconfigure when viewed with peripheral vision. Corporal Lisa Torres, calcined Reaper 7, our linguistics specialist, who spoke Arabic, Farsi, and Kurdish, fluently ran her gloved hand over inscriptions carved around the door frame characters that looked like Arabic script but now formed twisted into configurations that made her shake her head in confusion. She pulled out her phone to photograph the text, running it through translation software that struggled to process what it was seeing, finally spitting out fragments that read, "Surgical Theater of the Ascending Flesh," and "Laboratory for the Reformation of Divine Architecture," and phrases that made even less sense, like "where the puppet masters learn to dance." We forced the door open using mechanical leverage, the hydraulic systems that should have controlled it having failed years ago, and the smell that rolled out was overpowering, making 3 of my operators vomit into their face masks despite their combat-hardened stomachs. Inside, we found a descending stairwell lit by emergency lighting that somehow still functioned. Dim red bulbs that cast everything in the color of dried blood, and the walls were lined with file cabinets and document storage that had somehow survived whatever evacuation or abandonment had occurred here. Torres began pulling files, while the rest of us maintained security, and what she found in those yellowed pages and water-stained folders would recontextualize everything we thought we knew about this facility. The documents were dated between 1987 and 2015, written in a mixture of Arabic, Russian, and English, detailing a joint research program between Syrian military intelligence, certain factions within the Soviet Biological Weapons Directorate, and a private contractor whose name had been redacted so thoroughly that only the corporate logo remained, a symbol showing a marionette with strings extending upward into infinity. The research focused on what they called autonomous surgical entities, biological constructs designed to perform complex medical procedures without human oversight, created through a process that involved harvesting neural tissue from multiple sources and growing it into interconnected networks that could think, learn, and operate with superhuman precision. The files contained photographs that made my hands shake as I held them, images of operating theaters where bodies were suspended from the ceiling by their own vascular systems while these entities worked on them, surgeries that seemed to serve no medical purpose, but rather appeared to be acts of systematic transformation, turning human bodies into something else, something that the documents referred to with clinical detachment as post-biological surgical platforms optimized for extended consciousness integration. We had descended 3 levels into the facility, perhaps 120 feet below the desert surface, when the lights shifted from red to a pulsing amber, and we heard it for the first time, the sound of machinery. That wasn't quite machinery rhythmic clicking and whirring. It suggested mechanical precision, but with organic undertones like joints moving in sockets or tendons sliding over bone. The corridor ahead branched into multiple directions, and Jun's thermal imaging scope detected heat signatures in at least 4 separate rooms, signatures that registered as human temperature, but with distribution patterns that made no anatomical sense. Clusters of warmth arranged in vertical columns as if bodies were hanging suspended in midair. We advanced toward the nearest heat signature, moving in textbook tactical formation, weapons raised and fingers on triggers, every sense heightened to combat readiness that had kept us alive through dozens of firefights. The room we entered had been an operating theater. That much was obvious from the surgical lighting arrays still mounted to the ceiling and the tile work on the walls, designed for easy cleaning of biological contamination. But someone or something had transformed it into something else. The center of the room was dominated by a structure that looked like a massive surgical rack, and hanging from it by hooks and wires threaded through their own circulatory systems were 3 bodies that had once been human. I recognized one of them immediately by the tattoo still visible on what remained of his left forearm, the Montana state flag that Harrison had shown me with pride during our pre-deployment briefing just 6 days ago. He was still alive, or something approximating alive, his eyes moving to track our entry into the room, his mouth working to form words, but his vocal cords had been removed and laid out beside him in a neat coil like rope prepared for store. The other 2 bodies were in various stages of transformation. Their rib cages had been opened and spread like wings, organs rearranged into patterns that served no biological function, but possessed an undeniable aesthetic quality, as if someone was using human anatomy as an art medium. Then we saw what was working on them. Emerging from surgical ports in the walls came appendages that looked like they'd been grown rather than built. Tubes of translucent flesh containing visible networks of what might have been nerves or might have been fiber optic cables, tipped with instruments that ranged from recognizable scalpels and forceps to devices whose purpose I couldn't begin to guess. These things moved with fluid intelligence, responding to our presence by pausing their work and orienting toward us with a coordination that suggested shared consciousness. And when Chun opened fire in a panic that I couldn't blame him for, the rounds passed through the appendages, leaving holes that sealed themselves within seconds, the tissue flowing back together like water finding its level. The entities didn't attack immediately, but instead retreated into their wall ports, pulling back with a sound like suction, and in the sudden silence we could hear them, moving through the facility's infrastructure, traveling through walls and ceiling spaces, surrounding our position with a coordination that felt horribly purposeful. And I realized with absolute certainty that we weren't conducting reconnaissance anymore. We had become specimens that had voluntarily entered a surgical theater that had never stopped operating. The appendages emerged simultaneously from 17 different wall ports across the operating theater, no longer cautious or observational, but moving with predatory purpose that spoke to millions of years of evolved hunting, instincts somehow grafted onto synthetic biology. What had been 3 or 4 surgical arms multiplied into dozens then hundreds, filling the upper half of the room like a canopy of flesh and metal that pulsed with synchronized contractions. Each appendage tipped with instruments that ranged from wickedly curved needles to spinning microsaws that hummed at frequencies I could feel in my teeth. The temperature in the room began to fluctuate wildly, my body armor's internal sensors, registering drops from 68 degrees to 34 degrees, and back up to 89 degrees. Within 30-second intervals, condensation forming on every surface, and then evaporating instantly in patterns that formed concentric circles radiating from Harrison's suspended body. The gravity felt wrong. My boots seemed to stick to the floor with more force than normal, while simultaneously feeling lighter, as if the facility itself exists in multiple states of physical law at once. And when I tried to move toward the exit, my body responded sluggishly, moving through air that had developed the resistance of water. The surgical lights overhead began to strobe in patterns that weren't quite random, flickering in sequences that Webb's analytical mind recognized as mathematical progressions, Fibonacci spirals rendered in light and darkness that made our shadows split into multiple copies that move independently of our bodies. Through the doorway behind us, I could see into the corridor we'd just traveled, except it had changed. The walls now lined with viewing windows that definitely hadn't been there during our descent. And through those windows, I could see operating theaters identical to the one we occupied, each containing members of my team in various stages of surgical transformation. Visions that couldn't be real because those men were standing right beside me. Yet I could see Torres suspended from hooks with her abdomen open to reveal organs rearranged into geometric patterns. Could see Webb with his skull opened like a flower and his brain being carefully sectioned by instruments that moved with loving precision. Sergeant Webb was the first to break, dropping his rifle and clawing at his tactical vest while screaming that he could feel them inside. His head that something was measuring the spaces between his thoughts and calculating how to fill them with foreign consciousness. Chang grabbed him and tried to force his helmet back on, standard protocol for soldiers experiencing psychological breaks in combat situations. But Webb fought with inhuman strength born from absolute terror, his eyes rolling back until only whites showed, and blood vessels bursting across his sclera in patterns that formed those same geometric spirals we'd been seeing throughout the facility. Torres was backing toward the wall while maintaining her weapon's aim on the ceiling canopy of surgical appendages, her training holding strong, even as I could see her lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been her reciting the serial numbers of her equipment that old soldiers tricked for maintaining sanity when reality stops making sense. Corporal Jackson Hayes Calcine, Reaper 5, our demolitions expert who'd never shown fear during 3 deployments in the most intense combat zones the Middle East had to offer, was pressing himself into the corner and whispering that his hands weren't his anymore, that he could see through his skin and the bones underneath were moving wrong, realigning themselves into configurations that would make them better tools for surgical work. The radios had evolved beyond static into something worse, each headset, now broadcasting different sounds mine carried what sounded like. Harrison trying to speak, but using vocabulary that human vocal anatomy could unproduce. Clicking consonants and harmonic overtones that conveyed meaning. I could almost understand messages about transformation and elevation and the joy of being, disassembled by entities that understood flesh better than any human surgeon could dream. Chun's radio broadcast the sound of breathing, but from dozens of sources simultaneously, respiratory rates that syncopated and harmonized into patterns that my brain recognizes music, despite my conscious mind's rejection of that categorization. The equipment failures had progressed beyond anything our training had prepared us for. Torres's rifle scope was displaying targeting data for shots she hadn't taken yet, showing future positions of targets that didn't currently exist, while Hayes's night vision goggles had somehow inverted their function and were projecting light instead of amplifying it. Beams of illumination that carved through the darkness and revealed things moving in the shadows that disappeared the moment direct light touched them. My own sidearm's grip had become uncomfortably warm, almost body temperature, and when I looked down, I could see the polymer housing had developed a texture that reminded me disturbingly of human skin, complete with pores and what might have been tiny hair follicles, as if the weapon itself was being slowly transformed into biological matter by proximity to whatever presence inhabited this facility. The surgical appendages descended as one moving with coordination that spoke to singular intelligence distributed across hundreds of physical manipulators. And we opened fire with everything we had, full automatic bursts that filled the operating theater, with muzzle flash and the deafening thunder of military-grade weapons discharging in an enclosed space. The rounds found their marks tearing through translucent flesh and severing mechanical components, but for every appendage we destroyed, 3 more emerged from wall ports that kept appearing like wounds opening in the facility's infrastructure, the structure itself seeming to bleed surgical. Equipment into the room with inexhaustible supply. Torres went down first, not from the appendages attacking, but from backing into a wall that suddenly wasn't solid anymore, her body sinking into concrete that had developed the consistency of wet clay, the material flowing over her legs, and then her torso while she screamed and clawed at the floor, her fingers leaving grooves in tile that immediately filled with that same amber luminescent fluid we'd seen at the ventilation shaft. Hayes tried to reach her, but something wrapped around his rifle and yanked it from his hands with such force that it dislocated his shoulder, the audible pop of the joint separating, accompanied by his howl of pain. And then the appendages were on him, dozens of them working in concert to lift him from the floor and rotate his body into positions that allowed other instruments to access him from optimal angles. I watched in horror as they began their work on him, not killing, but transforming his tactical gear, being carefully removed and set aside, as if it were precious, his uniform being peeled away with surgical precision that avoided damaging the fabric, and then his skin being opened along lines that followed the natural topology of his muscular system, revealing the architecture underneath and beginning the process of rearrangement that would turn him into something like what Harrison had become. Webb had stopped screaming and gone completely catatonic, his eyes staring at nothing, while his body remained rigid, and when I checked his pulse, I found it was beating at over 300 times per minute, a rate that should have caused immediate cardiac arrest, but somehow his heart was adapting, changing, preparing itself for whatever transformation awaited. Chun and I were back to back now, the last 2 operators still functional, our ammunition running low and our options narrowing to nothing. The doorway we'd entered through had sealed itself with a membrane of tissue that pulsed with visible veins, cutting off our retreat and completing the trap we'd walked into with such professional confidence just 20 minutes ago. The appendages had stopped their attack and now hung motionless above us, forming a dome of surgical instruments that waited with infinite patience. And in that moment of stillness, I understood that we weren't fighting these entities. We were being evaluated, assessed, measured for our suitability as raw material for whatever project they'd been designed to complete. The air itself felt thick with intention. Every molecule seemed charged with purpose. It pressed against my consciousness, like hands exploring the contours of my thoughts. And I could feel something probing at the edges of my mind, not forcefully, but with gentle insistence, offering visions of what I could become if I simply stopped resisting. Images of myself transformed into something greater, my body optimized and elevated beyond the limitations of baseline human anatomy. My consciousness expanded and integrated into a network of awareness that spanned dimensions I currently lacked the sensory organs to perceive. Chun's hand gripped my shoulder, and I turned to see tears running down his face, not from fear, but from something worse, from understanding, from the terrible comprehension that whatever was about to happen to us might not be death at all, but something infinitely more complex. And in his eyes, I saw the reflection of my own face beginning to change, the skin around my jaw becoming translucent, revealing the muscle and bone underneath. The first stages of transformation that would ultimately turn us into willing components of a surgical system that had been operating in this underground facility for decades without pause, feeding on the soldiers and researchers foolish enough to enter its domain. The facility shuddered with an impact that had nothing to do with anything happening inside our nightmare operating theater, a massive, concussive force that traveled through hundreds of feet of rock and concrete and rattled the surgical instruments, hanging above us like wind chimes made from scalpels and bone saws. The appendages recoiled instantly, withdrawing into their wall ports with such speed that they left trails of disturbed air, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of what my combat-trained mind recognized as bunker-buster munitions, the kind of ordnance designed to penetrate deep underground facilities and collapse them from within. A second impact followed. Closer this time, and chunks of concrete began falling from the ceiling, the surgical lighting arrays sparking and dying as power systems failed in cascading sequence throughout the structure. Through the membrane that had sealed our exit, I could see shadows moving in the corridor beyond, human-shaped, but wrong somehow, their movements too fluid and coordinated to be normal soldiers. And when they breached through the tissue barrier, they came in formation that spoke to training even more rigorous than Special Forces protocol. They wore armor I'd never seen before, matte black composite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, helmets with no visible eye slits, but instead dotted with sensor arrays that glowed faint blue in the darkness. And their weapons were unlike anything in the standard military arsenal, compact bullpup configurations that hummed with energy I could feel in my fillings. The lead figure moved directly to Chun and grabbed him by the tactical vest, hauling him toward the exit with strength that seemed augmented beyond normal human capacity, while two others converged on Hayes and Torres, extracting them from the surgical apparatus with practiced efficiency that suggested they'd done this before, knew exactly how to disconnect human bodies from the facility's grotesque integration without causing fatal damage. One of the armored figures approached me, and I got my first clear look at the helmet's faceplate, seeing my own reflection distorted across its surface. And when he spoke, his voice came through a modulator that stripped away all humanity, leaving only clinical precision. Task Force Obsidian is compromised. You are being extracted under Broken Arrow Protocol. 7, do not resist. Do not ask questions. Survivors will be debriefed at secondary location. I tried to speak to demand answers about what the hell was happening and who these people were, but my voice came out as barely a whisper, my throat raw from screaming. I didn't remember doing. And when I looked down at my hands, I saw that the transformation had progressed further than I'd realized. My fingernails had become translucent, and beneath them I could see structures that looked like tiny surgical instruments growing from the nail beds. The armored figures moved us through corridors that were collapsing behind us, the facility destroying itself with systematic precision, as if it had a self-destruct protocol built into its very architecture. Walls folding inward and floors dropping away into darkness that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. We emerged into the pre-dawn desert air through an exit I didn't recognize, not the entrance we'd used, but an emergency egress tunnel that opened into a ravine half a kilometer from our original insertion point. And waiting, there was a transport that belonged to no military. I'd ever served a vehicle that looked like a cross between an armored personnel carrier and a mobile surgical unit, its interior fitted with medical equipment that began working on us the moment we were loaded inside. The 5 operators I'd left on the surface were already there, restrained to gurneys and sedated, their bodies showing early signs of the same transformation that had begun in Shun, and me the translucent quality to the skin and the suggestion of foreign structures growing beneath the surface. A woman in unmarked fatigues and a white coat stood over Webb, injecting him with something that made his convulsing body go still. And when she turned to me, her eyes held the flat affect of someone who'd seen this scenario play out dozens of times before and had long since exhausted her capacity for emotional response. She didn't introduce herself, didn't explain what was happening, simply began running scanners over my body while dictating notes into a recording device. Subject Reaper 6 shows Stage 2 integration. Surgical entity tendrils have penetrated dermal layer and begun restructuring of subcutaneous tissue. Neural contamination at approximately 40%. Recommend immediate quarantine and possible termination if contamination exceeds 60% threshold. Through the vehicle's narrow windows, I watched as the desert behind us erupted in a series of explosions that started deep underground and worked their way to the surface. The carefully controlled demolition collapsing the facility in on itself, and erasing any evidence that it had ever existed. Strike aircraft passed overhead, F-22 Raptors that broke away after confirming the target's destruction, and I realized this operation had been planned at levels far above Special Forces Command, probably coordinated by the same agencies that officially denied involvement in Syria altogether. The woman injected me with something that made the world start to fade around the edges, my consciousness dimming like lights on a circuit breaker being systematically shut down, and the last thing I saw before the sedation took me completely was Harrison, or what remained of Harrison, suspended in a containment tube filled with clear fluid, his body transformed into something that was no longer entirely human, but not quite something else either. His eyes still tracking movement with desperate awareness that suggested his consciousness remained intact and trapped inside flesh that no longer answered to his commands. The woman caught me looking and leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper that was almost sympathetic. He can't be saved. None of the Stage 5 integrations can be reversed. But he also can't die because the surgical entities rewrote his biology at the cellular level. He'll be transferred to a containment facility where we keep the other specimens collected from sites like this one over the past 30 years, and he'll exist there indefinitely because we still don't understand how to kill something that stopped being entirely alive. As the sedation pulled me under, I became aware of movement at the edge of my failing vision, something watching from the dunes in the distance, a shape that could have been a trick of heat distortion or could have been one of the surgical entities that had escaped the facility's collapse. It stood motionless in a posture that suggested patience rather than urgency, and I had the terrible certainty that it wasn't concerned with our escape because we were already tagged, already marked as specimens that would eventually return to complete the transformation that had been interrupted. And the last thought I had before consciousness left me entirely was the understanding that salvation was temporary, but integration was forever. And somewhere in the neural pathways being rewritten inside my skull, I could feel the beginning of something that might have been acceptance, or might have been the first stage of losing my humanity to a process I no longer had the capacity to resist. I woke up 6 days later in a medical facility that had no windows, no markings, and no identification beyond a series of numbers stenciled on the walls in a code I didn't recognize. The official story was already written, distributed through channels that reached from the Pentagon to Syrian opposition forces to international media outlets that would never question the narrative they were fed. Task Force Obsidian had been ambushed during a routine reconnaissance mission, killed in action by ISIS fighters using captured Syrian military equipment, their bodies too damaged by secondary explosions to be recovered for burial. 12 heroes who would receive closed-casket military funerals and commemorative plaques at Fort Bragg that their families would visit without ever knowing the truth. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thornwell was listed as having survived with severe psychological trauma, medically discharged with full honors, and a diagnosis of acute PTSD that would explain any inconsistencies in his story, should he ever be foolish enough to tell it. Chan was transferred to a psychiatric facility in Montana. Under a false name, his family told he'd suffered a complete mental breakdown and needed long-term residential care. But I knew the truth was that his integration had progressed too far to reverse, and they were keeping him contained while studying how the transformation would ultimately complete itself. Torres, Webb, and Hayes simply disappeared from all records, their service files corrupted by database errors, their families receiving death certificates without bodies and condolence letters signed by generals who'd never heard their names. The 5 operators I'd left on the surface were scattered across VA hospitals in different states, each diagnosed with different disorders that would keep them medicated and isolated, their testimonies fragmented and contradictory enough that no coherent picture could ever emerge. Harrison's family received a flag and a story about heroic sacrifice, never knowing their son existed in a tank somewhere deep underground, transformed into a specimen that could neither live nor die, but only demonstrate the horrifying potential of technology that should never have been developed. The facility in Syria became an unmarked crater officially attributed to Russian airstrikes, targeting chemical weapons stockpiles. And within 2 weeks, all satellite imagery of the area had been scrubbed and replaced with doctored images that showed nothing but empty desert. 3 months after my discharge, I received a package with no return address containing a single photograph, black and white, grainy, showing the interior of what might have been the operating theater where we'd found Harrison, but the date stamp in the corner read 1987, 30 years before our mission. And hanging from the surgical apparatus was a figure in Soviet military uniform being systematically disassembled by the same appendages that had nearly claimed us. On the back of the photograph, written in handwriting that might have been my own, but slightly off, just different enough to make my hands shake, was a single sentence. The theater is always operating. The performance never ends, and every audience eventually becomes part of the show. I burned the photograph that same night, but the message had already been delivered, and in the weeks that followed, I began noticing changes in my body that the military doctors had assured me were impossible. The translucence in my fingernails, returning dreams where I saw through eyes that weren't positioned in my skull, but somewhere in my chest cavity, looking outward through skin that had become transparent. The woman from the extraction team visited me once unannounced, sitting in my apartment without explaining how she'd gotten past locked doors, and she told me that I had 2 choices. I could spend the rest of my life being monitored as the integration slowly completed itself, becoming eventually what Harrison had become, or I could join the organization. She represented the people who cleaned up after incidents, like Syria, who contained the specimens and buried the evidence, and occasionally went into facilities that should have stayed, buried to extract soldiers who'd stumbled into nightmares beyond their comprehension. She left a business card with nothing on it but a phone number, and I've been staring at it for 3 weeks now, knowing that the moment I make that call, I'll be admitting that my humanity is already compromised that I'm no longer entirely the man who led Task Force Obsidian into that desert, and that the only path forward is to accept the transformation and use what I'm becoming as a weapon against the things that made me this way. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.